ahead and start. And after your presentation, we're gonna do an update from Claire. And actually, before we begin, I just want to see if there's any other updates from the wider SETI community. If you do have any updates, we have about 5 minutes built in for the permanent committee to make any announcements, or if there's any interesting jobs that you want to announce. For example, we are looking for 2 postdocs at Berkeley in our lab, so that's an update from us. And if there's any others, I think you can manually unmute your mic and go ahead and speak. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Cacophony. All right, so if there are no updates, we'll go ahead and get started. So Rebecca, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for being our first in a while presenter.
No worries, and I have about 30 minutes then, correct?
Yep.
Okay, then I will just start right away. So first I'm gonna apologize. I just returned from a 2-week fieldwork trip to Moscow in Russia. And the second I came back to Britain, I caught the flu. So if you see me sniffling or coughing at any point, I'm very sorry. I'll try to be as least gross as possible. So the talk I'm going to be giving is actually based on one that I gave at Berkeley last month. And it's on my PhD research, which is in history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. And I focus on Cold War scientific collaboration and diplomacy, focusing on the development of radio astronomy in the 1960s as a key episode within this historiography. A question I get a lot of the times when I give history presentations to a scientific audience is just sort of, how do you do the work that you do? So just to explain really simply how I conduct my research, I use primarily 3 methods. One is just reading the literature, right? Trying to educate myself on the history that already exists. The second thing I do is do archival research. So that means going into historical archives, having access to documentation, letters of correspondence between individuals, and essentially try to take the raw materials of this history and find what the story is out of those materials. And then the third thing I do, which is perhaps most recently relevant, is oral history interviews. As a historian who studies the 20th century, which we call contemporary history, I'm very privileged because most of my, or not most, but many of my historical subjects are still living. So that means I actually am able to go and meet with them, ask them questions about their lives, and get firsthand verbatim their words on the history that they lived. And so that's something I try to do as much as I can. So my PhD, the main argument of it is looking at internationalist beliefs held by mid-20th century radio astronomers and the challenges that those beliefs faced. And I tend to look at 2 primary subfields within radio astronomy. The first is, of course, SETI. And then the second is very long baseline interferometry, right, or VLBI. Those might seem like pretty disconnected parts of radio astronomy, but they actually have a really significant historical link, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to understand and appreciate that. The first thing that connects these 2 subfields is that both scientists in both of these fields shared an internationalist philosophy, especially in the 20th century. This makes sense very apparently with SETI because, of course, if you're conducting SETI searches, you aren't going to be conducting these searches thinking, I'm an American or I'm a Soviet conducting these searches. By fact that you are looking for civilizations on other planets, you're putting yourself into the shoes of human or earthling, and that is inherently internationalist. VLBI is also very internationalist, but not in such an inherently philosophical way, but just due to practicality, right? If you're in the 1960s and you want to conduct a VLBI experiment with really high resolution, you are going to have to work with scientists, ideally on other continents, and that means international collaboration on large scales, where you really have a science-first mentality. And these mentalities and these ideas are expressed in really vivid ways. While I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of meeting with David Jauncey, who is an Australian astrophysicist, and he was one of the early VLBI pioneers. He was really active in some of the first experiments that were conducted in the 1960s. And he was in Moscow because he was there for the Radio Astronomy International Science Council meeting. And I had the opportunity to sit down with him and conduct an oral history interview. And during our interview, he said that one of the major strengths of an area like radio astronomy, and in particular VLBI, is that they don't just deal with their own countries, they literally deal with the world. And the Cold War was going on, in the 1960s, but the scientists were still collaborating. He said these things are separate from politics, and I think that's a very powerful phenomena. So this internationalist philosophy wasn't something that was just below the surface. It was very on the minds of the scientists that were conducting them. And of course, David Jauncey was talking about VLBI, but it's pretty apparent that these things would have been in the minds of SETI scientists at the time as well. And this sounds just absolutely lovely, right? Global unity. But of course, the flip side of it is that despite the feel-good narrative of internationalism, there was, of course, still politics and challenges. And this is most apparent when you look at the Soviet side of things, but certainly it's there in other countries as well. During my fieldwork trip in Russia, I also had the opportunity to meet with the director of Pushchina Radio Astronomy Observatory, which is a couple of hundred kilometers or so south from Moscow. And the director told me that he started working at Pushchina in 1960. And his first trip out of the country wasn't until 14 years later. And then he wasn't able to leave for another 14 years. So international scientific collaboration for him was really challenging. And I was asking him about the various reasons why this might be the case. Sorry, I'm very ill. And he told me that, sorry, that one of the challenges was, wow, I'm losing my voice. Sorry. One of the challenges was that he was not a member of the Communist Party. I'm very sorry, Julia. I appear to be losing my voice in the middle of this talk.
Do you need a few minutes to reset?
I'm so sorry. I have the flu and I wanted to power through this, and I can. Just give me one moment, please.
Sure.
Sorry.
Take your time. I can do some updates on our revamped SETI community meetings. I forgot to mention in the beginning that for this next revamp, we're going to be doing an early one for the US, like it's 10 a.m. Pacific time here, and I know it's quite late in Europe, but still hopefully a manageable time. And our next meeting will be at 4 p.m. Pacific in November. So hopefully catering to our Asian Australian collaborators there. And we will be recording all of these, and we're going to try and live stream them. So if you can't be there in person, you'll be able to join, or if you're not part of the SETI community, you'll be able to live stream it in the future. So that's just a quick update on these meetings. Becca, are you feeling up to finishing the slides? If you need a break, just let me know. Oh, and she just.
Oh, there it goes. Would everyone find it horribly, horribly rude if I had a lozenge in my mouth while giving this talk? We're all friends here, right? This is okay. Okay, so I'm gonna just try to power through this. Thank you for being patient with me. This is what happens when you travel to about 12 different cities in a month. So jumping off from where I left, Rustam Dagestmansky, who's the director of Pushchina Observatory. in Russia, he was explaining to me that one of the reasons why it was really challenging for him to travel outside of the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s is because he wasn't a member of the Communist Party. And as you can see on the slides right there is a quote from him. And so the politics were really apparent and on the surface when dealing with the Soviet Union, but they were there all along, despite the internationalist philosophies of the scientists involved in these various experiments. And as I continue to go through the presentation, that will become apparent. So if I'm going to share a little story with you on the progression of SETI and VLBI and these internationalist ideas throughout the 60s and early 70s, a good place to start is with Project Ozma. I'm sure that most people here are familiar with Project Ozma, but just to recap briefly, it's often considered the first modern SETI experiment. It was conducted by Frank Drake in 1960 at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory on the 85-1 telescope. 85-1 telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia. He observed two stars, Epsilon Eridani and Tau Ceti. And of course, the results were non-conclusive. But it being the first modern SETI experiment set off a wave of inspiration around the world. And you can see that here on this slide. We have on the top the specs from the Project Ozma radiometer, but underneath it you can see a copy of that same radiometer, but in Cyrillic, in Russian. And the reason you can see a copy of that is because it was part of this book titled Vyselianaya Жизнь Razum, which was written by this man, Yosef Samuilovich SHKLOVSKII, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about him for the next few minutes. So Yosef Samuilovich SHKLOVSKII was a Soviet astrophysicist. He was one of the most esteemed astrophysicists in the mid-20th century, and in fact, he pretty much got radio astronomy up and going in the Soviet Union. So, of course, I'm sure many people here know that in the 1940s, the transition of neutral hydrogen was predicted by Hendrik van der Hulst in the Netherlands, but because of restrictions between sharing journals and publications across the Iron Curtain, SHKLOVSKII had not been able to obtain that information. However, in another journal article, he saw the citation referencing the fact that van der Hulst had accomplished this. And so he was able to independently calculate it himself and publish that in the Soviet Union. And so that was one of his great achievements earlier on in his career. And because of that, he had sort of a affection for the 21 centimeter hydrogen line. So then in 1959, when this paper, Searching for Interstellar Communications by Giuseppe Cacconi and Philip Morrison, was published, it proposed to use the 21 centimeter hydrogen line to conduct SETI searches. SHKLOVSKII, when he read this, thought, you know, wow, using my 21 centimeter hydrogen line to look for extraterrestrial civilizations, it really inspired him. And that's partly what led him to writing this book. So Vyselianaya Жизнь Razum means universe, life, mind in Russian. And this book, in addition to being sort of a general popular astronomy book for the general public, also mentioned a lot of SHKLOVSKII's ideas on early SETI. And some of these ideas were very technical, but some of them were also very imaginative. And SHKLOVSKII tended to live a life that was in dichotomies like that, a life between extremes. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union launched their second lunar probe, and on it, SHKLOVSKII had attached something which was called an artificial comet, which had helped the Soviet Union be able to track their satellites and their launches. And because of this, he was awarded a Lenin Prize, which was one of the top awards in the Soviet Union, a really big honor. But despite that fact, SHKLOVSKII was never made a full member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He only was a corresponding member. And that's because although he was a really eminent and respected scientist, he was also very outspoken and not always in support of Soviet policies and practices. And so that led him to a lot of trouble. And oftentimes he was barred from traveling abroad despite his accomplishments. In fact, there's a story that's told that SHKLOVSKII, when a colleague from overseas came to visit and asked SHKLOVSKII why he wasn't at the most recent IAU meeting, and SHKLOVSKII said, "Oh, it's because I have diabetes, too much Sakharov." So in Russian, Sakhar means sugar, but Sakharov was the name of Andrei Sakharov, and he was a nuclear physicist who was a dissident in Russia. And SHKLOVSKII had written a letter in support of him, and that led to a lot of trouble in his own life. So he was a person who vacillated between extremes like that. Nonetheless, he is eminently respected within the institutions he was a part of. I recently, in Russia, was at the Aerospace Center, which is part of the Lebedev Physical Institute, but housed within the Russian Space Research Institute. And they've memorialized his office, as you can see here, and inside there's a statue of SHKLOVSKII. So he is someone who's incredibly well respected in the former Soviet Union and, of course, Russia. So next, what I want to talk about is how SHKLOVSKII, despite having all of these challenges with going abroad and working with international peers, ended up co-writing what was essentially the first popular SETI book with Carl Sagan. So I did my master's dissertation on this book, and perhaps many of you know the book, Intelligent Life in the Universe. It was once very popular, although it is sadly now out of print. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, it is a popular science book that focuses on a lot of different themes, but mainly focusing on the idea of intelligent life out there in the universe and how we might be able to contact it and what it might look like if we do contact it. But the book itself, despite that traditional narrative that we're now quite accustomed to, had a really peculiar structure. And that is that if you look at the book, there will be lines of text which are SHKLOVSKII's original words, and then in between there will be little delta signs, one normal and one inverted, where Sagan has interjected his own ideas to the narrative. And so the book reads somewhat clunkily as a conversation between a Soviet scientist and an American scientist on the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence. And it's really peculiar. And the reason that's the case is because what actually the book is it's Vasilyanaia Жизнь Разум. It's Universe, Life, Mind, SHKLOVSKII's book that he originally published in 1962. But what happened was Sagan had acquired the book and decided that there should be a translation made of it. And so Sagan wrote to SHKLOVSKII saying, "Hey, would you like an English translation made of this book, and we can, publish it then throughout the world?" SHKLOVSKII eagerly agreed to this, but Sagan, in a perhaps somewhat typical manner, ended up annotating the book so much so that it about doubled in size. And SHKLOVSKII did not know that was what was happening with his book. So if you go into the Library of Congress Carl Sagan archives, you can see correspondence between SHKLOVSKII and Sagan in the early 60s as they were negotiating the publication of the translated book, which ended up being a co-authored book. And SHKLOVSKII sends, SHKLOVSKII, who actually was originally trained as an artist, sends these great little notes to Sagan, which have doodles in them that are somewhat passive-aggressive, as you can see from this one. Translated, it says something along the lines of, "I hope in this new year my book will be translated in your country. I wonder when that will happen." And of course, he doesn't know that the reason it's taking so long is that the book isn't simply being translated, but of course, Carl is adding substantial amounts to it. Now, you might think that SHKLOVSKII would have been quite unhappy to receive a manuscript in the mail that no longer just has his name on it, but Sagan's now squished next to it. And perhaps he was initially, but he ended up realizing later on that there was a big advantage to publishing the book with Carl as well, because SHKLOVSKII had to represent, in order to get the book, his book published in the Soviet Union, certain points of view that aligned with Marxism and Soviet doctrine. And so you can see this in one of the lines in the book on the left. Carl Sagan writes, "At this point in the Russian edition, Shklovsky expresses his belief that as long as capitalism exists on Earth, a violent end to intelligent life on the planet is probable. I am able to imagine alternative scenarios for the future." But Shklovsky later, in 1981, at a SETI conference in Estonia, admitted that in his book, he must show respect to Marxism and work according to Marx. But after preamble, Sagan can write, well, according to Kant. And this is fine, because then he can show Soviet officials who say that this book has a mistake. He can say, well, it's not my mistake, it's Carl's. And so, in fact, publishing the book with Carl Sagan allowed Shklovsky a bit more freedom in expressing a wider set of ideals to the public. And you can see this long-lasting association and relationship Shklovsky had with Carl Sagan still to this present day. I was able to visit Sternberg Astronomical Institute during this past trip and see Shklovsky's old office. And of course, they had a plaque on the wall commemorating him, but I looked to the left of it in the bookcases, and there was a picture of Carl. So this was a rich friendship and collaboration that's been commemorated to this day. So switching gears a little bit, speaking of Sternberg Astronomical Institute, which was where Shklovsky worked much of his life, he had a student named NIKOLAI KARDASHEV, and in 1963, Kardashev presented this paper, Transmission of Information by Extraterrestrial Civilizations, to the first Soviet SETI conference that was held in Armenia. And in this paper he presented, he made the argument that Frank Drake's approach in Project Ozma, which was to look for, Earth-like planets around sun-like stars and see if we can find the same sort of emissions that might be coming from our own planet. Instead, we should be looking for signs of super civilizations. So rather than looking for the needle in the haystack, look for something that's much more apparent and obvious. And so it was in this paper that he proposed his Kardashev scale of civilizations. So type 1 being a planet which emits energy kind of equivalent to its own planet. Type 2, its own star, and type 3, its galaxy. And so he proposed that sources of these evidence of these civilizations would have really small angular dimensions, but be really, really bright, and have spectra that look to be artificial. And he sketches all of this out in this paper. And at the end of the paper, he proposes that two sources, CTA-21 and CTA-102, might be evidence of these types of civilizations. And so Shklovsky, who of course was the supervisor of this department and very sympathetic to SETI, had another student, GENNADI SHOLOMITSKII, conduct a search looking at CTA-21 and CTA-102. And when Sholomitsky looked at these sources, he did indeed find something particularly interesting in CTA-102. He found that it wasn't just a small, very bright source, but it was also variable. This is significant for two main reasons. One, in that Kardashev also gave variability as a possible example of extraterrestrial intelligence in a source, but also there had been, up until that point, this is 1965, no evidence of radio variability other than Cassiopeia A, which was only variable in the sense that it was decreasing in luminosity over time. And this CTA-102 was periodically variable by about 100 days. So really, really interesting, groundbreaking with or without SETI considerations. So in 1965, after receiving these results, Sholomitsky publishes an astronomical telegram showing his results. And unfortunately, his results were largely not accepted by the general public. That is because Sholomitsky, in his telegram, he actually was not able to list the telescope he used, which is really odd. It's like, imagine doing an observation nowadays on something like, I don't know, Mazars, and not saying that, oh, well, I used the Green Bank telescope to make these observations. So a complete lack of absence of what telescope he used. But then also a lot of lack of information about, what wavelength he was observing at and things like that. So there's a lot of details missing. So as a result, radio astronomers in the community at the time looked at this and said, well, how are we supposed to believe these results? It seems, first of all, unbelievable and maybe impossible. A periodic variable radio source at a period of 100 days, and you're not telling us any of the information on how you've reached these results. And so, as you can see here on the top of the slide, Ken Kellerman from the National Radio Astronomy Observatory said, since there's little known, these results haven't been accepted. And the reason SHOLOMITSKII didn't publish that information is because he had conducted his observations on the Pluton Deep Space Communications Complex in Yevpatoria on the Crimean Peninsula, which you can see a picture right there. That's from Leonid Gurvitz, who I think is watching. Hi, Leonid. And that was at the time used by Russian military, the Russian state, for deep space communications with interstellar probes. And this is the height of the space race, right? So this is top secret stuff. And so SHOLOMITSKII wasn't able to publish the information on how he conducted his observations. Nonetheless, they actually were true. He did see the first periodic variable radio source. And so the Soviet Union went about publishing and promoting this fact. And in the Sternberg Astronomical Institute, there was a man named Alexander Midler, who was a TASS reporter. For those of you who do not know what TASS is, it was one of the major Soviet state news outlets. Rather than, you know how today, if like the New York Times wants to get out information really quickly, they'll just post it onto their website front page, or they'll put it on Twitter or Facebook. Obviously, in the 1960s, they didn't have that capability, so the best way to get news out really quickly was to send out telegrams. And so TASS was a news agency that used telegrams to promote news. And Alexander Midler was a journalist who oftentimes hung around the Sternberg Astronomical Institute, trying to listen in, see if he could, glean any interesting new scientific discovery that he could get a scoop of and put it out for TASS. And he overheard one day about SHOLOMITSKII's discovery and a comment someone at the observatory made about this possibly being like one of Kardashev's type 2 or type 3 civilizations, and perhaps they've made the first discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. So Midler really, quick to get the scoop, sent out a telegram titled, "The Soviet Union is contacted by a friendly civilization," and of course this caused a lot of mayhem. And so there had to be a press conference at Sternberg a couple of days later, where the scientists tried to say, well, it's possible that it could be extraterrestrial civilization, but most likely it's some sort of natural phenomena, which indeed it was. It was a quasar. But it still caused, by the fact that TASS had promoted this, caused a lot of chaos in the Soviet news media, but also international media. You can see in this newspaper clipping here, this is actually in the Coventry Times, so it's a British newspaper. They've asked Sir Bernard Lovell, who was the director of the Jodrell Bank Observatory in Manchester, and he called the claim that CTA 102 might be extraterrestrial intelligence or a super civilization sad. And newspapers all over the world, if you do a quick Google on news databases and archives for CTA 102, you'll see just lots of newspaper headlines with scientists around the world really deriding this. And so it was quite an embarrassment for Soviet science. And so there had to be quite a lot of backpedaling and repairing of what this discovery actually was and what it meant. However, not all of the news coverage was negative. This is a newspaper from Australia that shows Ken Kellerman, who is the same man who you saw in the previous publication had said that SHOLOMITSKII's discovery had not been accepted. But when he had just heard of it, he had actually just conducted his own SETI search. And this Australian newspaper says that Dr. Kellerman will fly from Sydney to Moscow on Tuesday to compare notes with the Russians. And so it is true that Dr. Kellerman, before he started his position at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, had been a postdoc at CSIRO and had been interested in SETI and did fly to the Soviet Union to talk to Kardashev and SHKLOVSKII about CTA 102 and about his own SETI searches. And that's really significant, that visit. And the reason that's so significant is because it set up a relationship that ended up having a lot of impact. And I'll explain a little bit why. And this is also what bridges the link between SETI and VLBI thematically. And that's because if you want to study small sources of small angular dimensions that are really bright, what's the best way to do that? Well, very long baseline interferometry. So SHOLOMITSKII, KARDASHEV, and a man named Leonid Matvienko published what was essentially the first paper proposing VLBI as a technique, just right after this, still in 1965. And so there's no, of course, direct evidence that the reason Kardashev and SHOLOMITSKII did this was for SETI purposes, but of course, them being interested in conducting observations of sources with small angular dimensions, it seems like a natural conclusion. So Kellerman went back to the United States and began his position at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory and began conducting some of the earliest VLBI experiments on his own independently prior to publication. And he had a successful experiment in the US and a successful international experiment between Green Bank and Sweden. And so he and his team at NRAO decided they wanted to find what was the longest possible baseline on Earth at the highest possible frequencies. And at that time, they realized that it would be in the Soviet Union in a telescope in Pushina, which is about 100 kilometers south of Moscow. So they wrote Lebedev Physical Institute, which runs Pushina Radio Astronomy Observatory, proposing a joint US-USSR VLBI experiment. And they received a letter in response saying, absolutely, let's do it. And so this led to the first large-scale VLBI collaboration between two countries that, this is the 1960s, the height of the Cold War, the height of the space race, and you have these two countries collaborating with one another in a very complicated experiment. And this could be used as an example, again, of that internationalist spirit. You have these scientists who want to achieve the same things, are interested in the same things, and don't care about politics, want to achieve their goals despite it all. And there's this lovely picture here on the PowerPoint of John Bolton and some Soviet astronomers drinking together in celebration after their successful experiment. But nonetheless, even this experiment was loaded with lots of problems and lots of conflict. One example off the top of my head is you see that telescope down there in the bottom left. That is the 22-meter dish in Crimea. Originally, in the letter, they didn't know about the United States scientists did not know about the existence of that telescope. They had been proposing to use the 22-meter in Pushina, right? I was in Pushina just about a week ago and talking to the director, and he took me out to see the 22-meter telescope. And he told me that the reason why this telescope wasn't used in this first VLBI experiment between the US and USSR was because what happens if you conduct VLBI in reverse, right, with geodesy, you get really accurate measurements and maps, right? The Soviet Union didn't want such accurate maps and locations so close to Moscow because they thought that would give the US a defense advantage over them. And so they actually wrote back and said, actually, let's use the telescopes further away in the Crimea instead. And I found out by looking through some documents at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory archives that actually the US had the same concern, and the Department of Defense visited the National Radio Astronomy Observatory to try to figure out what were the risks of geodesy in these experiments and giving defense advantages to either country. So it's a great example of seeing how there's an event that is both imbued with an internationalist spirit, but at the same time is in the heart of conflict and geopolitics. So it's very interesting, and it's all linked up again with SETI and SETI searches. And of course, this early experiment led to relationships being formed that lasted for a really long time. Shortly after this experiment, Kardashev and Matvienko were invited to Green Bank to conduct experiments and observations using the National Radio Astronomy Observatory's telescopes, and those collaborations continued for a really long time. And in fact, a few years later, in 1971, there was the first US USSR SETI conference, which had a lot of the same people. Dr. Kellerman was there, Kardashev was there, as you can see in this picture, Sagan and SHKLOVSKII were there, and there's a lot of really interesting things about this conference. I could talk about it endlessly. Just an amazing assortment of people. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, was there. But the thing I want to focus on, just real briefly before ending this talk, is the person who I, perhaps unsurprisingly, think is the most interesting person in attendance, and that's the historian. There was indeed a historian present at this conference. His name was William McNeill. He was a really eminent historian at the University of Chicago, and he was invited for a very particular reason. He had recently published a book titled The Rise of the West, and we now take for granted the idea that global history, international history, world history are quite normal words in our lexicon. But in the 1960s, that was a really unusual idea. Up until that point, histories had been, histories of particular nation states, right? So you'd have an English historian, a French historian. So the idea of having a historian who combined the narratives of multiple countries or looked at what happened when different civilizations met and interacted with one another, that was really new. And so Carl Sagan invited McNeill on the basis of thinking, well, this is where SETI and history overlap. Both groups were looking at what happens when civilizations meet and interact with one another, civilizations that are alien to one another. And kind of ironically, that's also what was happening at that conference. You had the Soviet Union and the US, two peoples that were alien to one another, meeting and trying to communicate. And it's no coincidence that Philip Morrison, who was also in attendance at this conference, thought that the reason why historians, anthropologists, archaeologists should be invited to this conference was because they were presumed experts on the final variable in the Drake equation, which I'm sure you all know is L, right? The longevity of a civilization. And it's no coincidence that scientists in the Soviet Union, in the United States, at this point in history, were really curious about what happens with civilizations that become technologically powerful and capable. Are they capable of destroying each other? Are they capable of having peaceful interactions with one another? And so that's partly why McNeill's presence was so desired at this conference. They thought that by looking at human civilizations, we could glean some sort of understanding into what might happen and how we should go about contacting extraterrestrial intelligence. So I want to end with just one question, which is, why should you care about this? Why should I bother doing this? And why should you listen? And not just me, but other historians. Why study history? And there's a lot of reasons. One is just that it's interesting, right? Why do you do astronomy? It's interesting. But beyond that, there are some really practical and important implications of doing this kind of work and work like it. One is that, as you can see from the relationships that were established in the early 60s and 70s between SETI scientists and VLBI scientists, those relationships have impacts that last to this day. Just up until the beginning of this summer, Radio Astron, right, which is the first space VLBI satellite, had been in operation and was a huge point of collaboration between the Russian Aerospace Center and the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And that was a collaboration that was really due in part to those people who I've been talking about. And so by studying the history, you can understand how you got to the present day and why it is you're doing what you're doing. But then beyond that, it also is a useful tool for learning from the past. I had the privilege of sitting down with Jill Tarter a month or two ago, and because I have access to people who lived the history, I often try to ask them, what do you think the most important part of this history is? Because that gives me a better insight of what I think I should be focusing on. And Jill said to me that she thinks the most important part is learning what happened with the defunding of SETI from the US government. And it's true that if we start digging into that history, we can understand moving forward what works and what doesn't work. And so history can be a really useful tool for SETI and for science more broadly. So with that, I think I'll end. I think I managed to hit time and my voice hasn't given up, so I'm done.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. A quick history on Rebecca. She came and gave a similar presentation about a month or so ago here, and I was so impressed by her thorough research that I thought this would be a wonderful first kickoff meeting to everybody. So I'm sure there's some folks in the audience that have questions, but I just want to see if anyone who's lived some of the SETI history learned something new, because I know a lot of us here at Breakthrough Listen learned something new, even though we're all SETI nerds. So if anyone wants to comment or share, you can go ahead and unmute your mic. Claudio?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. This is an excellent presentation. I lived long enough to see the last part of that, and really I would like to stress the international viewpoint of all this story. Yeah. So let me just ask you, are you going to attend the IAC in Washington next week?
Unfortunately, I can't make that particular conference, but I do try to attend as many conferences as I can, generally speaking.
Okay, no problem. But sooner or later, we have to meet sometimes at some international conference, because this idea of the history that I picked up this summer in the new version of Big History is something really important for appreciating SETI, not only by the technically skilled people, but also by the lay people. So thank you very much, Rebecca.
Well, thank you. I'd love to talk.
Awesome. Are there any other comments from the audience or questions? If not, I have one of my own, but I want to let others share if they like. All right, so you mentioned, Rebecca, that you tend to ask folks what is something that they think is the most interesting aspect of SETI to help inform you of your research. But I want to ask you, what's the most interesting thing that you found in your research or surprising to you personally?
Yeah. Wow, that is a very complex question. So I think that the way that I first came to the research was just a sense of awe at how much had been accomplished despite the complex geopolitics. And so I really was initially just inspired by the internationalist perspective. I thought that actually, so I think I've told you, Julia, but for those who don't know me or haven't heard me talk about this before, the reason I first started researching SETI history was because I was doing my master's degree at the University of Oxford in history of science, medicine, and technology. I knew I wanted to do Cold War history and something to do with aerospace and astronomy because that's my background, but I wasn't really sure what, and I stumbled upon Intelligent Life in the Universe. And as I was reading it, I was just like, this is the weirdest book ever. How can something like this exist? How can there be so much contact, communication, and collaboration between these two nations at this time? And I think that is what initially inspired me. Of course, I kind of tend to be a natural optimist, and so I really am drawn to the internationalist perspective. But of course, when doing serious history, you tend to not want to create just like this sunny, perfect picture that like, look, everyone wanted to work together and they held hands and it was all happy-go-lucky. No, I also then, as I was digging into this internationalist narrative, found how much conflict and challenges that were imbued in these collaborations. And in some sense, that gave me an even greater appreciation for the fact that anything was accomplished, because it really just shows you how persevering these individuals were, especially those in the Soviet Union. When I was in Russia these past 2 weeks speaking with former Soviet scientists, some of the challenges those people have been through is just unbelievable. And it's a real testimony to their willpower and ingenuity that they have been able to accomplish what they have. So that is just incredible to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. David, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Hey,
Hello,
David,
everybody. Hi, Rebecca. I hope you feel better soon. Thank you for that really interesting talk. I'm glad I was able to tune in for it. I share your fascination with the with Intelligent Life in the Universe, with the Sagan and SHKLOVSKII book. It's an amazing book. I guess my question is about this story that SHKLOVSKII really didn't know what Sagan was up to. I mean, I've heard that story also, and in fact, SHKLOVSKII says in his autobiography, he says the first he knew of this arrangement was when he got a copy of it with the two authors' names on the cover. And yet, the thing that is strange to me is, I mean, it seems pretty underhanded, and you know, I knew Carl, and a lot of other people in this community did, and you know, certainly he was ambitious and, you know, maybe you could say, you know, had a strong ego in addition to being obviously brilliant and an amazing communicator. But I wouldn't generally accuse him of being that sort of sneaky and underhanded. And so I guess what I wonder is, was there anything more to the story? Like, apparently you said you dug into the correspondence in the Library of Congress. Like, was that partially an inability? Like, did Carl try to let him know, and was there something lost in translation or lost in the mail, or did he really just spring it on him like that? Yeah.
So you bring up a really good point, and I don't mean to paint Carl in a negative image in retelling the story, because actually they ended up having, as I'm sure you know, David, a really long and strong friendship. In fact, SHKLOVSKII was not able to be compensated for his royalties from the book because of international copyright laws and restrictions the Soviet Union had. But Sagan still went out of his way trying to find ways to compensate him, paying for SHKLOVSKII's brother's medical bills when he was in the hospital. And so it wasn't like a hostile takeover. I think there were two factors here that should be taken into account. The first is that, a lot of mail went missing during this time period, right? It's not unusual it wasn't unusual at the time to send a letter to or from the Soviet Union and open it up and find that it had been, read and taken out and then resealed. And there is actually evidence, if you look at the correspondence in the Library of Congress archives, that SHKLOVSKII will say, "Hey, like, didn't you get my last letter?" And Sagan will say, "Oh, nope, I didn't." So that is there. And the second thing is, you bring up a really good point when you mention SHKLOVSKII's autobiography. For those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend going and finding it. It's called 5 Billion Bottles of Vodka to the Moon. And it's a compilation of SHKLOVSKII's just like short little anecdotal stories. And it's true that, and this is a danger when doing contemporary history, is that when you're working with individuals who are recounting their own histories, people tend to create narratives, right? Our memory's faulty. This is why first-person testimony in courts of law isn't taken as seriously as documentary or other sorts of physical evidence. And historians have to take this into consideration as well when we're doing our work. I can't just take the word of someone of what they said in an oral history interview to be purely fact. And so I did have to go through like Library of Congress archives and try to verify stories on multiple ends. And yeah, so it's true that you just can't take the simple narrative. Of course, in a short talk like this, I can't go into the nitty gritty of the details, but you try to do so when you're writing a book.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, thank you so much. Is there any other questions? If not, I think we're going to turn over to Claire Webb, who is going to give us a brief rundown of some awesome activities happening at the IAC conference happening in DC. Hopefully most of you will be there.
Should I unshare my screen or?
Let's see if Claire needs any slides.
Let me see if I'll.
Hey.
Claire, we can hear you.
Hey. Yeah, no, I don't need any slides, but I did want to just run through the activities on the website. So I would like to share my screen.
All right, I think there's a way for you to do it.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Hey. Okay. Hey, okay. Rebecca, thank you so much. So it was fascinating. Yeah, Rebecca and I have like a lot to talk about, so I'm looking forward to talking to you offline at some later point. So Julia, thank you so much too for reviving these meetings, and like huge props to you for organizing them and your graphics, and it's just wonderful. So very quickly, I want to run through events happening at the IAC. So I'm sure all of you know, all of you kind of know the plan. Let me just share my screen.
You see it?
We can see it.
Oh, great. Okay, I already did that. Okay, so we are Breakthrough Listen and the Berkeley SETI Research Center are going to be staffing the booth along with some people from Breakthrough Initiatives. So this website, ilbe2019.com, is a way for you to be kind of updated on all of our events. So the IAC is kind of in two organizations. The IAA is organizing the booth, and the IAF is organizing the special sessions and the technical sessions. So this is kind of, this website is a location to find out information about both kinds of activities. So it's next week. I think opening ceremonies are like at 10 a.m. or something like that. We're going to be doing people, we really don't have that much staffing filled out, so if you could please add your name to that spreadsheet so I don't have to assign you. And what would be, I would be very grateful for, it seems to me that some people are leaving on Thursday. I'm going to have a ton of material to break down, and it's just going to be too much for me to handle. So I would be very, very grateful if a few Breakthrough Listen people who are going to be there through Friday sign up to help me do that. It's just going to be impossible for myself. Okay, so the theme of our booth is the search for technosignatures. And our mission, just so kind of everyone is on board, is really trying to display to private space companies, government space agencies, international researchers that we are doing cutting edge astronomy, radio astronomy, optical astronomy, using machine learning, using AI techniques, and we want to collaborate. We want to work internationally. We have a lot of exciting new instrumentation at our disposal. And so we want to kind of promote the idea of collaboration around technosignatures. So that is kind of your mandate. Our special session is Tuesday, October 22nd from 12:30 to 1:30. So we have what I think is an absolutely great cast of characters around the theme of life's journey through the universe. So that theme is a way to kind of bridge both the astrobiologists on the panel and also the SETI scientists on the panel. Pete of Breakthrough Initiatives is going to be moderating. I am kind of on there as the token historian, but we have some great astronomers, Bill Diamond of the SETI Institute, Sarah Seeger, Lucianne, Mike, and then Andrew, of course. So these are kind of the SETI at the IAC events that we want to highlight. This is in flux, so please do keep up to date on these events. So we have opening ceremonies, Claudio, the IAA symposium, that's on Saturday. So please do email him if you plan to attend. That's going to be kind of like an informal, our community kind of welcome to the IAC, or just, you know, get together, familiar faces. So just so you all know, I'm sure you all know this, Tuesday is the big day of the SETI at the IAC. So we have just a ton of technical sessions. There's SETI 1, SETI Science and Technology, that's in the morning. Our special session, you know, unfortunately, there was just like a scheduling conflict. So the special session is going to start 15 minutes before the first technical session ends. Then we have our second technical session later in the afternoon, same room. We're having a community dinner, so that will be very fun, I think. And Thursday, the interactive presentation. I know Jill is on that, but I'm not sure where, who else is involved. I don't know who else is going to the IAC Gala, but that's kind of the closing event. And then here are just some helpful links. Okay, so I'm really excited about these booth events, and I want to give a shout out to Dave and Daniel, who have absolutely been killer at kind of coordinating these events. Also, Eric and the new media intern Spiros are in the midst of kind of putting together some activity as well. So I'm just going to run you through these really quick. So the scavenger hunt, I am heading up. So that is going to be every day from at 11 and 3 p.m. And again, like, we just don't know exactly how this is going to work, except for Monday. We are doing a test run at 11 a.m. So I would be very grateful if right after the opening ceremony, we could all, if the breakthrough team could assemble at 11, just because we're going to do like a run through. So we have, I think, the New Zealand Space Agency, we have the UN space group, we have, I think, 12 different booths. We have prize packets, and so basically there's this app called Scavify, and I'm working on it right now, but basically participants download the app, they answer questions, they take selfies, they scan QR codes, they can post on Twitter as like different activities. You get points. The winning team gets a prize. I think we have first, second, and third place. So that's going to be really fun, and I would love your help at 11 a.m. on Monday to do a run through. Okay, so then we have, sorry to interrupt, I need to go get my computer charger. Zoom takes up a lot of energy. Can you just excuse me for 1 second? Thanks.
Sure, anyone got any good SETI jokes in the meantime? I have one, and probably anyone who's known me knows this joke. But how do you say hello to a two-headed alien? No one?
How do you say hello to a two-headed alien?
Hello, hello.
I have a good Russian cosmonaut joke.
Go for it.
So why did the cosmonauts in the space station keep hitting their head with each other?
Why is that?
Because objects in mirror are closer than they appear.
All right, I think we've exhausted our two SETI jokes. So that's your homework for the next time. While we have any sort of gaps, we can insert them with awkward SETI jokes. So if you have any, please research them and bring them to the next meeting. And Claire, do you have any last remarks? The floor is yours.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have more. Yeah, so
we're a little over time, so I just wanted to, if people need to leave at 11,
right.
so go for it.
Really quickly. So Dave has been designing a technosignature with DeepSig to decode for a message, so you can participate in prizes. We're going to have a create your own Drake equation. Daniel has designed this absolutely fabulous app, I suppose. We're also having a poem or an essay contest. We're going to have a series
joke
of
contest?
Huh?
Just poems and essays, not jokes.
Yeah, I think that there would be no probably. Yeah. Okay, I'll just wrap up. If you have questions, you can email me. Otherwise, just keep checking the website because I'm going to keep updating it.
Well, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Claire, for all of your hard work with this. It's really amazing and coming together, and I can't wait to see it in action. So thank you to both of our speakers. If there are no last remarks, we're going to go ahead and conclude this meeting, and it is being recorded. So if you missed some of it or came in late or want to share it with your friends and colleagues, we can certainly do that. So stay tuned for more. And our next one will be talking about the all of the basically technology that Breakthrough Listen is using right now all over telescopes and how we're using that to do SETI searches. And that will be given in about a month by Dr. Vishal Kajar and Dr. Alex Polak from the ATA. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next time.
Can I ask a question quickly?
Sure.
Go for it.
Yeah. Will any of the IAC stuff be streamed?
Do you mean at the conference itself?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't fly to be there, but I could log in if there was a stream.
I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone?
Yeah, I think Claudio might. Bringing the Claudio.
Claudio, let me unmute you.
Yes. Okay. So yes, the answer is that thanks to Andrew and his team, we can have the meeting of the IAA SETI Permanent Committee on Wednesday, the 23rd, 9 through 12 noon, of course, Washington time, broadcast everywhere in the world. So this is my answer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mario.
All right, with that, I think we'll say goodbye, and thanks again for tuning in. See you next time.